Are you still seeing the PowerPoint?
No, I can see SharePoint.
Ah, okay, I see what it's done. It's taking it away. Okay, so now I don't, can I actually just stop sharing and then Rachel, can you share for me, please?
Sure.
Because I don't think I know how to do this. Okay, stop sharing. There we go. Does it work on yours or not?
It's still showing yours as sharing. Maybe it's just loading.
Oh.
There we go.
Cool.
Okay. Sorry, I don't have mine open at the moment.
But anyway, while Rachel is finding the presentation, we just wanted to let you know, obviously, there's specific objectives that we want to share with you in this event. But also, if any of the expectations that you have are not met through the objectives that we have, please feel free to scribble in the chat box, and then one of us will actually pick this up. So our objectives are mainly strung around 3 different areas, even though they appear as if there's like 6 bullet points or 7 bullet points. But mainly we're looking at, the first initial stages of how you identify potential funding. And then once you identify that potential funding, how then do you respond to that particular funding opportunity? Or how do you write your application? How do you know what things to actually include in your application? And then once you've actually done the application itself, the submission process itself, but also things to look out for when you're making the applications. So the experiences that we share with you today will mainly be based on our work that we have done in IDS. If you have any experiences as well to share, please put them in the chat box, and we'll be very happy to learn new things, because we always know that things are improving every day. Obviously, one of the things that we want you to take out of this is see how applicable that is, because we are also aware of the fact that, our experiences might not necessarily fit with your experiences, but we're hoping that there will be something that you can pick up from the presentation today and that you can bring it forward in terms of your work going forward. Could I have the next slide, please? So IDS funding is actually, it comes from a diverse range of sources. Our annual income is 23 million per year. And we get this funding from various funders. Some of them are government departments. A large number of our programs are funded by FCDO, which is the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. But we also get other government departments that also, that we also get funding from. For instance, here we've included DEFRA. We've got other governments as well, not necessarily just the UK. So we've got the Swedish SIDA, for instance. We've got SDC, which is a Ministry of Foreign Affairs arm in Sweden. But we also get some government funding from USAID, for instance. In addition to that, some of our funding comes through UK Research and Innovation, and that is where 7 different research councils sit. And most of our funding actually comes from Economic, Social and Research Council. And obviously, because we are social scientists in IDS, you'll find that a lot of the calls that ESRC will put forward are relevant for IDS. But we also get funding from Arts, Humanities and Research Center, which is AHRC as well. And one of the things that we also find is that through our partnerships, we're able to participate in some of these different research councils. As you can see from their names, so the EPSRC is Engineering and Physics Social Research Council. MRC is Medical Research Council. NERC is Natural Sciences Environment Research Council. So you can see that there's a wide range of different councils that they fund. And most of these actually the research that's covered by these research councils is mainly highly intellectual academic stuff that they're looking for. So it's always very useful for organizations like IDS to go for these opportunities because they suit the type of work that we do, the research that we do, but also it strengthens our relationships with other academic institutions, other higher education institutions, as well as universities in the countries that we actually collaborate with. But we also get some funding from some trusts that we know very well in the UK, and also we get some funding through foundations. So in the UK, for instance, we get a lot of funding through Wellcome Trust. You will have seen on our website, Melissa, our director, is actually working on some different projects that are related to pandemic preparedness. And of course, some of it is related to the work that she did in the past around Ebola response, which actually established an anthropological platform in terms of how the countries that were affected by Ebola were responding. They've used similar models as well for COVID pandemic, for instance. So Melissa actually sits on World Health Organization Advisory Board, where they have been looking at how countries could prepare around that. But we also get some of the funding that we get is not necessarily just for research. Some of the funding that we get is maybe, for instance, like for scholarships. The Fundraising and Development Office comprises of Alumni Office, which is led ably by Michelle, who's hosting this event today. And we do get some funding for some students who are coming, and some of the scholarships are pretty tied to specific areas, but just like any other funding that we get, all funding has got specific criteria that you have to meet. So once opportunities come, it's not like everybody can just jump for those specific opportunities. But also some of the work that we do as well comes through consultancy-based type of work. So we could, for instance, be approached by UN organizations, it could be UNICEF, it could be UNFPA, it could be World Bank, who issue consultancy opportunities that will seek specific expertise for specific areas. And when we are able to, we respond to those. And one thing to bear in mind is that obviously all these funders will have different funding requirements, will have different funding application requirements. So we often find ourselves that we have to always keep ourselves updated in terms of what are they looking for. So even though it might be the same funder, it doesn't necessarily mean that every funding opportunity will come in the same, in the same avenue that it came through, or through the same portal that they advertised. And each of these have got different platforms that they advertise the specific cause, and it also depends on how much money is available. So for instance, FCDO has got a limit of 124,000 that if you want to apply for a smaller grant, so they classify that as a smaller grant, they're not necessarily advertised in public portals or in public platforms. Those type of opportunities will normally come directly from somebody who knows somebody in an organization, who possibly contact IDS, contact our office to say, we have this piece of work if you're interested. However, any other opportunity they advertise, they have a portal which you have to register for as well. And this is also similar with other funding organizations, that they will have a specific route in terms of you accessing their funding opportunities. So it's worth bearing in mind as well to know which portals you need to subscribe to, or which newsletters you need to subscribe to, so you can see all these funding opportunities. Another, the other way that we actually identify these funding opportunities as well, we subscribe to different platforms. So in our case, we have Research Professional, which is a subscription that will collect specific research academic research opportunities. And these are tailored around development research as well, not just any type of research, but specific for development, which fits very well with IDS. But for such subscriptions, obviously, they come at a cost, so they're not cheap. But the advantage of having such a subscription is that it allows you to go in there. You can tailor your specific funding requirements. You can tailor the specific partners that you want to find in, but you can also, it's called Research Professional. So everybody who works in IDS, and I'm sure with students as well, you can access it as long as you are in IDS building. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Michelle has put it in the chat as well. But also we subscribe to other newsletters like, Bond. Bond are very good at, finding different opportunities, and most of the opportunities that they put will range from smaller like CSOs or CBOs to larger NGOs, but also to larger organizations as well. So there is a wide range of opportunities that you can just go on their website that you will find, and they're specifically related to development. But also we sign up to different newsletters. So the foundations that we work with, so think about MacArthur Foundation, for instance, MasterCard Foundation, Org Foundation. We have several foundations that we interact with, and we subscribe to their newsletters. So every time there's a new call that's coming in, or there's a new area that they're focusing in, or when they're developing their new strategies, we do get access to those as well. So we are way, way ahead in terms of knowing what each foundation is going to work on, especially the foundations that we are interested in. Another thing that we do as well to identify these funding opportunities is there's always network events that take place. There's always information events that other organizations will also hold just to gauge interest in a specific area, for them also to know if it's feasible for any study that they want to commission, for instance. And it is during those events that usually the funder will also, as they're giving out the information, they'll also put in additional information around some funding opportunities that they expect to come in a few months' time, or sometimes in a year's time. So it's always important to listen to what these events will give out in terms of information. Networking obviously is a very important thing to any event that you go, because sometimes you don't necessarily are not going to attend funding events, but you might go to meetings, and usually there's always one or two people who will know about other funding opportunities that you would not necessarily have heard of, or a funder that you not necessarily have thought, or perhaps I could apply funding from that funder. So it's always important as well to make sure that when you're networking, listen out, what are the opportunities that are there that you can actually dwell into, or that you can explore further into. Could I have the next slide, please?
You do have a question in the chat, Wesley. Just before you move on.
Yeah. Is I for individual or institutional funding options as institutional reputation matters? Which I? Am I missing something?
Amna, would you, is it? There we go, thank you.
Oh, okay. Is it for individual or institutional funding options as institutional reputation matters, whereas for individual? Okay, this is a very important question. So for IDS, when we're looking at consultancy opportunities, for instance, even if it is looking for one person, we still have an institutional way of responding, because obviously the person will be contracted under IDS, not necessarily them as an individual, because everybody who's working for IDS will get that work in the name of IDS rather than their personal. And that's only to do with protecting the person's reputation, but also protecting IDS's reputation. We may have instances where perhaps, a funder might not necessarily be happy with how we have actually produced some work. And if we leave it for the individual to sign the contract, that doesn't help them, because it means they have to be liable for any legal things that come from there. So we make sure that every contract that is signed, whether it's just for one person to do the work, is actually signed for and on behalf of IDS rather than the individual. Does that answer your question? Okay, we can go back to that. Thank you. So how do we find funding, right? So obviously we all work in different areas. In IDS, as you will have seen, we have 10 different clusters who work on a wide range of topics. Clearly our strategy has prioritized like 4 different areas that we're going to focus on, right? So for instance, look at climate and environmental justice, for instance. You have to start thinking from the base, thinking, okay, what is my idea? What is the thing that I want to write about or that I want to research further into? And once you actually know the idea that you want, then you have to start looking for, okay, what are the organizations currently who have got opportunities that they are advertising for this specific area, right? But also sometimes it's a matter of thinking, if calls are not live, right? So, you know, what other things can I do? Are there organizations I can speak to? Are there individuals who might know specific funders who might possibly be interested in this piece of work? So it's also thinking through that whole process, because the way IDS actually operates, most of our funding actually comes from reactive funding, right? So we wait for opportunities to come up. So like in the past financial year, like 2019, 2020, 67% of our, no, 87% rather, of our funding actually came from reactive fundraising rather than proactive fundraising. So you always have to make that balance in terms of, okay, the idea that I have, do I want it to be funded now? And is there a specific call that is available that I can actually tap into? If there isn't any funding available, you then have to think about, okay, what organizations have funded this type of work before? And if they haven't put a funding call, is there a way that I can reach out to them? So earlier I had spoken about the different types of organizations that we get funding from. A lot of foundations, for instance, do not advertise for funding opportunities. Basically, they will contact you or you will contact them, and then you initiate, you know, the conversation, and then eventually you will build up the idea that you had alongside with what they want to achieve. So you always have to make sure that there's alignment between what the organization, funding organization, wants to do and what your research idea is about. So that's another option that you can do. So you approach a foundation. Usually there will be letters of inquiry that are online that will give you a specific format in terms of what to write, but they'll also sometimes ask you to present to them before they can let you submit something so that they can actually look at. So one of the most important things to consider is look at funder websites, right? So if you know who the particular funders are in this specific area, explore on their websites, find out what programs they have funded in the past, because you don't want to end up writing an inquiry to them for work that they've already funded. You know, chances are that some of the work that you might want to you might want to do might already have been done. So if you still want to continue with your idea, you need to find what is unique in terms of you taking forward what ideas have already been done for them to find that attractive, right? So use your skills to research background work, read their annual reviews, read their annual reports, read their publicity, you know, documentation, read their news, because they will often write in there about the work that they're proud of, people that they have funded, organizations that they have funded, and that will give you a clue. Another thing as well is if you read their strategies, they will outline in those strategies the specific areas that they are intending to fund during the strategy period. And usually strategy period for most organizations are 5 years. So you can then tell from that by narrowing down, by looking at the projects that they have funded to see, okay, perhaps, you know, my area is still of interest, but maybe I could tailor it in another way. So for now, for instance, because of the pandemic, we've noticed that a lot of organizations have had to go back to the drawing board to review their strategies. So some of them have actually changed them. So it's quite important as well, because you might have read a strategy in the last year thinking, oh, I'm up to date. I know what this funder is going to fund. I'm okay. I can just go ahead and write my funding application. It's worth always revisiting that, especially when you're developing your idea, to see whether it still is aligning with what their interest is or not. But also at the same time, use your networks, right? So Rachel later on will talk about the importance of partnerships, and that will give you an idea of what you can do and cannot do with your partners. You know, one of the things obviously will be around funding, right? because some of the funding applications that you might come across might have restrictions in terms of who can apply for those specific funding. Some of them are restricted because of geographic region. Some of them are restricted based on the amount of income that your organization already makes annually. And some of them are restricted simply because they are tied to specific types of organizations that they're trying to promote their work for. So it's important to use your networks to find out these opportunities, but also to understand further, because some of your networks as well might have experience with that specific funder. Some experiences might be good experiences, some experiences might not be bad experience, may be bad experiences. So it helps you to gauge whether it's okay for you to go ahead with them or to explore other avenues. But also you have to think about what is it that you're looking for, right? You have this excellent idea, but even though it's excellent, how much time are you looking for, right? How much money are you looking at in terms of applying for the funding? What additional support do you need? And who is going to be involved, right? And how do you take that idea forward? Do you need to work with other partners? Do you need to work yourself? Do you need to work with other colleagues in your organizations that you're coming from? So think about all these processes and also think about, okay, what is the main purpose of me applying for this funding? Because sometimes people might actually identify an opportunity and think, great, this is brilliant. I want to write that application. But sometimes it's a matter of thinking, does the time fit very well with what you're already doing at that time? And do you have the resources to enable you to write that application and on time as well to make sure that it's submitted on time? Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just to give you a project cycle quickly in terms of, what are the things you need to be thinking about when you have developed that idea, right? So obviously you have to work at, you start with the problem, right? So you've identified there's a gap in a specific area. And I'll give a specific example. It could be around increasing girls' access to education, right? So if you're thinking about that, why do you think increasing girls' access to education is important? You will have done a literature review for you to be able to find out some information that there are some gaps. And maybe you have picked this up to say, oh, okay, in terms of completion of school or attendance of schools, in this case, we find that there's only boys who are attending school more than girls. But then you need to go deeper, right? Identify what is the problem behind that. And if you dig deeper, you might find that maybe girls mainly do a lot of housework at home, right? And some of the parents might decide, because this is a girl, I'd rather keep them home, but also they'll get married. What's the point of taking them to school? So that's the problem that you will have identified. And out of that, then you will build your aims and objectives, which will help you develop the specific research design that you're looking at. So it will help you develop the specific questions that will address the problem that you have identified. So in this case, we're looking at increasing access for girls. So you have to think about, okay, why do girls not actually access schools as much as boys do, right? What are the reasons behind that? And what are the things that could enable them to attend school, right? So that will help you develop what type of research do you want to do? Is it going to be qualitative research? Is it going to be quantitative research? Or is it going to be mixed methods research? That will help you then to develop the types of activities that you want to help you understand the research questions that you developed in the first place. And by doing that, you're building your case support in terms of what the story is behind your intention for the research that you're proposing. And by building that, you then have to make sure that every activity that you plan for and every staff or resource that you need for is also accounted for. We have people sometimes who come with brilliant ideas, but they'll not necessarily have thought about the time. So some people might overpromise. They might say, oh, by the end of this research, I'll have made sure that 5,000 girls in this community, which is like maybe maybe 100,000 can at least attend school. Your objectives have to be really realistic, because the funder will come back to you and bite you and say, this is what you promised in the first place. What happened? And as we know, a lot of funders are looking for impact when they're reading the application forms. So you need to demonstrate clearly and in a coherent way what change is your project going to bring to the funder. will they be able to demonstrate that change has happened and it has happened because of your research? What exactly do you want to get out of it? But also think of other outputs that you want to generate out of that. It's not just about making sure that the girls are accessing school more, but also what are the publications that you might think might be useful for other people to learn from? You know, can your research be replicated elsewhere? Can it go on a larger scale, and can it inform policy? You know, as you will see IDS's work, a lot of our work actually focuses on how we can influence policy. And this is why we engage with organizations that we do and the partners that we do, because we realize that a lot of the change actually happens if you work, you know, not only with the funders, but also the people that you are researching into. So don't see them as the subjects that will be studied, but how do you then engage with them? So that's also quite important. As an output, how do you then demonstrate afterwards to say, once the project funding is finished, what happens afterwards, right? So sustainability of that project, you've got to put all these into your case for support to make sure that you're addressing all the important questions. Another area as well is once projects are going on, there'll be learning events that will happen, but there'll be also learning opportunities that you'll pick things up. So how do you evaluate whether your project is actually achieving what you had set to do in the first place? But where there's no, you know, where this hasn't happened, you pick up that as well to say, okay, if we haven't met the objectives that we set, what has hindered us from, you know, enabling us to achieve the objectives? And you take that as a lesson that you take aboard. You know, you can take it to the funders to say, because of this, we're not able to achieve that. Perhaps maybe we need to think about this in another way, or perhaps maybe we could collaborate with ministries of education in these various, you know, locations that we're trying to increase access, or perhaps we could work with the parents. So take that as a very important aspect of your case for support as well. But also every project comes with risks, right? So a lot of people sometimes will write a fantastic proposal, but they might not necessarily think about, you know, things to do with ethics. You know, do you need to get ethics clearance? You know, some of you, you know, when you're doing your dissertations, there might have been opportunities for you to conduct research, or perhaps in your work you do conduct research. You know, with that, we just don't get to the participants. Some of them will need to get their consent. We'll need to let them know, you know, how we'll obtain information, how we'll store the data that we actually acquire from data collection. So all these issues are also important to consider when you're developing your proposals and thinking about how you present it in the case for support. And of course, you know, if you're doing your research in the, you know, in Europe, there's obviously the general data protection rules that you have to abide by, you know, in terms of storage, who has access to the data, and then what happens to the data once the project is finished, and also the outputs, what intellectual property rights do you have to any publications that you produce? Are they yours? Do you actually share with the funder? So all those things are things that you need to be thinking about when you're developing your case for support. Could I have the next slide, please? So there was a question actually, which was related to criteria. How do you know what funders are looking for? So if you're responding to a call, they will specify what they are expecting to see in the proposal. So though, you know, the range of criteria will vary depending on what the funder is looking for. Other criteria is very short, and other criteria is long. And other criteria, sometimes, very rarely, it will not be there, but you will see hints of it in the course specification that you will have been responding to. In the case where you're not responding to any specific call, this will probably come up in the conversations that you will have, but also it will come through the different strategic priority areas of that specific funder. So it's important to pay attention. And here we've just listed a few of those. So obviously, you know, you have to think how relevant it is and whether there's need for that specific area, right? You know, how does it fit with the objectives of that specific organization? What is the change that your project is actually going to achieve, you know, by doing this work that you're proposing? And, you know, accountability, how are you going to be accountable in terms of the work that you're doing? How will you demonstrate that, not only for you, but also for the users of the research? What about the reputation of of your organization. One of the things they will ask is, if you're the lead applicant, they will also ask you to demonstrate that you have led a project before. So they'll look at your managerial capacities. They'll also look at governance issues, how you deal with problems when they arise during implementation of programs. But they'll also look at how known your organization is around the specific work that you're applying for. So how, if you've done really well, I mean, look at IDS, for instance, with Sussex, we continue to be, to be identified as #1 in the QS ranking for development studies. So that, precedes, when we're going for the application, plays very well for us, because we can demonstrate that by doing research, but also being, in the #1 for this position for so long, 5 years now, I think, if I'm counting correct. We can actually demonstrate that we have the capacity, we have also the capability to do the work. But also they'll look at the location of the activity. Some evaluation is quite specific. They will say, we will only fund organizations that are based in the Global South, and sometimes they'll specify the countries. And sometimes they'll also say, we will only fund if there is a mutual partnership in place. So they don't want you to work with other organizations just for the sake of, they will do some of the groundwork and will do the majority of the work. We're seeing a lot in evaluation criteria now that a lot of funders are actually asking for, interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary research, but also mutual partnership. So they want you to create the proposal together, rather than, as a lead, IDS will then write the proposal and then we'll just add partners. And I'm sure you will see this as well in your different types of work that you are involved in. But also they look at sustainability, right? A funder will give you money, but then they'll also ask you the question, what happens to the program once the program funding is finished? They want their program to continue ongoing, even if there's no funding available. So you have to think of, okay, what are the other options that are available? Should I think about applying for another funding through another organization? Or is this a program that the community, wherever I'm working, they can actually just continue doing the work but funding themselves one way or another? Or are there any small local charities that can step in to continue carrying the work that you started, right? And also, one of the other things that you'll find is they'll look for value for money, right? Value for money is always important. They will always weigh the option in terms of, how expensive are they or how cheap are they? And you have to remember that there will be so many applications that evaluators will look at. And most of the times, as much as the idea might be excellent, most of the times they will also look at budget. Budget is very important, right? Because obviously they will clearly outline, if it's a core, some of them will clearly outline how much money is available and how many applications they are willing to fund. If, for instance, in IDS, we will get, we'll get an opportunity that says there's 5 million available, we're looking to fund between 3 to 5 programs, we know that the competition is very high. So when it's like that, you always have to make sure that if you're proposing an idea, even if it's innovative in its approach, don't make it too expensive. But at the same time, you also have to make sure that your time is actually covered. I will not cover all of those examples there, but we'll share the presentation as well, so you can look at some of the criteria as well in terms of what's important when you're filling in your application form. I think I've mentioned value added anyway. So make sure that if you're putting in partners, it makes sense. Don't just put them for the sake of, I need to put this partner so that it looks like I'm thinking about everybody. No, you have to think seriously about that as well. Could we move to the next slide, please? So,
can I just interrupt for a second? Because it's been a lot of information in a short space of time.
It is.
And I don't know about everyone else, but my brain takes a while to catch up. So I thought we just have a quick breath and see if there's any questions, just for a few seconds. So if anybody's got any questions about what Wesley's spoken about already, or anything about fundraising that's specific to you that you would like answered, then feel free to say, by taking yourself off mute, or put your question in the chat. But I just thought it was worth just taking a quick kind of breathe, stand up, move your hands around moment.
And don't forget to write the funding experience that you have, please. Sure. Shall I go on? Yeah. Looks like there's
Yeah, go on. But yeah, please put questions in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go along, as well as there'll be an opportunity at the end as well.
yeah. And I should
Sorry,
have,
I did have a question. I don't know if you can see me. In terms of, hi, I'm Kushali. I'm working in fundraising for a really small storytelling charity at the moment. In terms of approaching really big foundations, or if they have calls open, who do you approach, or how do you find out, you know, before you start writing your application, they say that you should try to initiate contact with a human at the foundation. So how do you go about, is there like a way that you can go about doing that that's more effective than other ways than just calling someone?
yeah. So cold calling, as you've identified, is not actually what foundations look for. Most of the times you will hit a wall if you do that. The way we have done it in IDS is we actually make sure that if we're contacting a foundation, we have an existing contact that we already know. If we don't know anybody in that foundation, we will try to use our contacts. As you will appreciate, IDS has got over 60 academics. There will be one person who knows somebody who can then connect us to those foundations, but also our director, as well as the director of research, are well-connected people. So we use their contacts to get in through that way. But also there's another way which you can do, which we normally do if you're involved in communications, which is what they call the kind of the bottom-up pyramid, where if, for instance, in your role, if, for instance, I'm a program manager and I don't know anybody at the top for that foundation, I'll make sure that I find who the project manager in that foundation is, and I'll just send them a gentle email to say, I would like to initiate contact. And sometimes you might not get responses back, but most of the times somebody at that level is humble enough to actually respond to your email. And by the time, so you build that relationship slowly, because obviously with foundations, especially if they don't put up calls, it takes much, much longer to build that relationship up for you to get to the point where then you're able to ask for the donation. So usually it starts slowly like that. But also most of the people actually nowadays, if you use your LinkedIn, for instance, right? A lot of people use LinkedIn. If you know which specific person works in which department, if it's of interest to you, because obviously they will put different people under different thematic areas. Once you know them, make sure that you find their email address, whether through LinkedIn or through other means, and then just send them a gentle email to say, I would like to get in contact. When you have time, give me time. You know, it's the pestering that helps. So all the time, they will then give up, and then they'll give you some time, even if it means it's 10 minutes of their time. But you just have to make sure that that 10 minutes of their time is used to the most effective, because obviously they'll be very busy people. And then they need to take that idea then to somebody who's senior from them. So you need to present it in a way that is actually quite interesting for them to feel like, oh, I think this is interesting, would like to work with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I might add on to Wesley's point as well. So hi, I'm Jack. I'm also in the fundraising team. When I was working at a smaller place and you don't have as many contacts, something I found quite useful is that effectively when you do have to resort to kind of a cold calling-esque format, is again, LinkedIn is immeasurably valuable, just for kind of figuring out the structure, and then following Wesley's kind of pattern is a really good way of making contact. So my only addition would be, if you're trying to manage all of that information and new relationships, which can end up being a lot of potential prospects, is to, again, and if you're doing it on a shoestring budget in particular, is to build up kind of a spreadsheet with the kind of, you know, person's details and the relevant columns. And then the real trick is to use something that I quite enjoyed, was either something like HubSpot, which you can use for free, which is a kind of CRM, and you can invite up to 10 people to join that. But if you're quite small, that might not even be a problem. I mean, there's not even 10 people on our fundraising team, so we would be able to spread that quite far, or even something called Streak as well. So Streak is a Gmail plugin, so even more technology friendly, and or as in, if you don't feel like moving to a whole other technology platform you're not familiar with, Streak is quite a nice way of managing those conversations. So HubSpot or Streak would be good beginners.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Brilliant. Another thing as well, actually, there's you know, when we were talking about networking as well. So in London, I know there's somebody, I think it's called Paul Van Zyl, I think. He's set up what's like a hub, what's called a conduit. And he would normally organize events, and he would bring in different funders as well who were able to come and attend those events. And they usually, it will give you an opportunity to meet other people that you wouldn't necessarily have met, but also you would be able to hear what other funders are thinking about in terms of developing. So it's always, there's always a plugin somewhere that you can get some of this information. It sounds daunting at first, but once you start, you will then develop ways of how you can actually capture some of this information. There's a question in the chat. One of them is, will there be anything on applying for funding or investment for startups? I'm not sure about the investment for startups, but there is something on applying for funding. There is something in this presentation. Perhaps on the investment for startups, it might be good just to hear more what that was referring to in more detail. And then another question is, how open should one be while explaining risk in a proposal? Wouldn't talking explicitly about risks reduce chances of grant applications being successful? Cool. It is important. The importance of talking about risk is mainly around how you will deal with participants, right? Because some of the research that you will be doing will involve working with vulnerable people. So if you are working with vulnerable people, you need to demonstrate how you will make sure that they are protected, they are not harmed in any way. So we always use the do no harm approach, where you ensure that all your participants are protected, their identities are kept anonymous, and any funder would like to see that addressed. It's not good for you to anticipate that by writing risks, it means you're saying that you will not necessarily be able to carry out the work. You are basically just saying, I've got systems in place that will ensure safeguarding issues are looked after, that will ensure people are protected, but also giving the funder that assurance, because most of the times ethics will come part of a due diligence check as well, which comes at the end. Once you've been awarded the contract, they will look at these policies. They'll ask you, do you have a safeguarding policy? Do you have data protection policy, for instance? So it's always important. By addressing it, you don't necessarily have to bring in the negative. You just have to say that by working with specific population, we anticipate that there might be problems relating with, for instance, some of the work that I have done was involving collecting data from government officials, and ensuring that their anonymity is actually kept was actually quite key, because obviously they were giving me confidential information that they wouldn't necessarily want to come back to them for fear of them losing their jobs. So it's just ensuring that you are complying by types of work, and making sure that your work is ethical. So writing the application, so you have to think about the practicalities, right? When you're writing, we've gone through this through the project cycle itself, so you have to identify a project plan and evidence, match it up with the, alignment of your priorities as well as the funder priorities, and make sure that when you're responding to that call, it is actually the right call. One funder can actually issue different calls, right? But with different thematic areas specifically. And some people sometimes will just look at the funder because they like the funder, they might actually want to write the application. It's not a good idea. You must make sure that your interests actually match up, because funders are very busy people as well. The people who will evaluate your applications, they're very, very busy people. They will receive loads and loads of funding applications. And usually, you know, under normal circumstances, I can give you an example in the UK here. When we apply for UKRI funding, the evaluators will tell us point blank that they're very busy people. They'll be going on a train. They'll have like a briefcase or something that they'll have all these applications in. They'll read the first 2 pages. If the first 2 pages do not match with what they're looking for, they'll never read the rest of the proposal. So that is how competitive it is. But also making sure that you're following the guidelines. Every funder will give specific guidelines for their funding applications. Most funders will give you an outline in terms of the format, what needs to be included. Where you don't have this as a given case, you have to think of, okay, what is it that I want to present? You know, what's the problem that I want to address? What are the research methods and design that I need to be thinking about? What's driving in terms of theoretical or conceptual framing, what's driving it to take it forward, but also what are the activities that can be planned and what are the risks that I need to think about. But usually most application forms will have a specific format that you have to do. But also look at the deadlines, right? And think about the practicalities. When people are working on funding applications, I can give you this for definite in ideas. When people are working on applications, they are also working on other things. They have teaching to do, they have other commitments that they have, and they have other projects that they're working on. So what we tend to do, our office will organize what is called a pre-proposal meeting once we know people are interested in an application. So we'll work backwards from the submission deadline, right? Say how much time do we have and how much time are you available? Are you able to do some of the writing? But also another thing that we have in IDS, which makes our proposal stronger, is a quality assurance mechanism. And we have what is called a proposal review group, which is a meeting. It's like a panel that is made up of other academics. We usually have 2 academics, and then we also have our partnerships officer as well. And we have somebody from communications. They have to read the proposal 10 days before the deadline. So if you're in IDS, you have a much shorter time to work on your application. So the earlier you start working on a proposal, the better. And that quality assurance process helps us to firm up on the proposals that go out. But it also helps to strengthen the proposals themselves, because people get feedback from their peers in terms of what they're writing, but also to gauge whether they're actually hitting all the right buttons that the funder is expecting to see in the application. And could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so when you're writing, one of the most important things is to check that the language that you're using is easy and accessible. We have seen some applications sometimes that when you read even just one paragraph, it's too dense, you can't understand what the idea is. It's important to remember that the people who are going to read your proposal, you know, not all of them are actually academics. Academics on an evaluation panel are actually not as high in terms of number. They also have other people who are sitting on the panel to look at the applications. So it's important to make sure that if you write something, give it to a lay person, ask them, can they understand what you've written? If they don't understand it, chances are that somebody on the panel will also not understand it. So you have to know who you're writing your application to, make sure that the language is accessible, and make sure that your key message comes up front and clearly, rather than for them to read and then get to page 2, that's when the idea comes. It has to really stand out, jump out immediately to make the evaluator read that very quickly and get hooked to reading it, right? But also think of the practicalities. As I mentioned, in IDS, we always ask for a peer review process, which is 10 days before the deadline. You have to ask yourself, will you have a draft ready by then? Do you have the time to write that? And I'm sure this process can also be applied wherever you are working or what you're engaged in. You know, think about, okay, if I'm allowing myself 10 days before the deadline, what are the chances that I'll be able to finish my proposal on time? Or what are the chances that I could then produce a very strong, innovative and interesting proposal that when a funder reads, they're like, actually, this is well written, very easy to understand, but also an excellent idea for us to be wanting to fund it. But also think about who can give you advice. So, you know, in our case, we obviously have the peers who review the proposal itself, but also other people who have written proposals to that specific funder. They might actually know the funder very well, and they might have been successful in their application. What tips can they share with you? What are the things that you need to look out for, right? So in ideas, sometimes we do share some of these tips. We do share, depending on the funder, we will ask people for their feedback, how they found the application process, and we do share that information in order to enable other academics to be able to draw on that experience as well. And also the most important question, why is your idea important and why should it be funded now, right? So funders will not give money if they don't see the importance of that work for that specific time. So is it an issue that is actually gaining traction at that specific time? We know that with the pandemic, there'll be loads of opportunities that will come up. Right now, everything funding wise has been quiet for a long time, but once everything starts coming back, there'll be a lot of how do we build better? How do we build back better, right? So there'll be different issues. So you have to think about your ideas going forwards. How can we take your ideas around the challenges that COVID brought around it? Start thinking in advance, right? Because when the calls start coming, they might actually come as a barrage of loads and loads of opportunities, and you might get distracted by that. But if you have an idea in mind and then you're thinking through, okay, these are the areas that we can focus on, then that would be very, very helpful. But also think about, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This is a very key area that all funders now are asking for in each and every proposal that we're seeing, that we're putting in. They want this to be a very, very key component of applications. So make sure that you do include all this, but also have a checklist of don'ts, right? So there are stupid things that people make when they're putting applications in. I can give you an example. The Economic and Social Research Council, for instance, are very specific in terms of the font that you're supposed to use. They're very specific about the margins in terms of the centimeter sizes. They're very specific about attachments as in length, how much they should be. Some people sometimes forget taking that into account, and we have seen proposals being rejected. Even though they were very good proposals, we have seen them being rejected on the basis that they did not follow that. Because the first thing to know is that when we submit these applications, they go first to people who are supporting administratively, and they are quite pedantic in terms of checking. They'll have a checklist, they'll just check, are the attachments the right size? Yes. Is the font the right size? Yes. Once they tick a no, that's put aside. So don't disadvantage yourself by ignoring the small detail that will be specified in the course specification. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so elements of a proposal. This is when you're thinking about getting started. So read the guidelines really carefully. Our office, Fundraising and Development Office, we are very good at keeping track in terms of what is required. So we'll look at the application requirements, and we will actually set up a specific meeting that will look at each and every section of an application form with the person who is interested in applying. And that is actually quite very good, because it makes people being aware of the amount of work that is required. Because sometimes people are interested when they see an email that's come through with an opportunity, the first thing they'll do is they'll jump to the opportunity to go like, oh, I'm interested in this one. But actually sometimes it's a matter of going through the different sections in terms of what is required. Then people realize, oh, there's a lot that I need to think about. They've got to think about the writing itself. They've got to think about, if there's any institutional approval that needs to happen, obviously, because some of the applications will have restrictions to say we can only accept one application per institute. What happens if we get more than 2 or 3 people interested? So in IDS, we have a system that's called demand management. And demand management, by that, I mean, we ask people to submit an expression of interest. There's a specific form that we hand out to people, and it will have the specific criteria that they have to match with what the funder is looking for. And then we have to decide, we take you to SLG, Senior Leadership Group, strategic leadership group rather. We take it to them and then they decide which proposal or which idea has got more chances of actually, going forward because it's been developed. So thinking about those things as well, because obviously that will take some of the time itself, but also thinking through who else needs to be involved in your proposal in terms of doing the work, right? Do you need partners? How many partners do you need? If it's specific for some areas, how do you identify those partners? And then you have to start writing. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just sharing some of the tips in terms of you preparing your application for funding. So if you're excited about an idea, make people excited, right? When they're reading it, they should just be glued when they're reading it immediately. They'll be like, wow, this is exciting. I want to read more and more. The buzz that you have when you're talking about idea should be exactly the same when you're writing your proposal. Whatever language that you're using, accessible as it can be, make sure that it will hit the right buttons of the funder. But also you have to explain how that specific research that you're proposing will open new horizons or opportunities. What does that mean for this specific area? Are you going to add something methodologically or conceptually or understanding the policy or whatever area it is? What opportunities is it going to bring? Is it going to broaden your areas of work? Is it going to bring new partnerships for you as well? But also, as I explained before, right? Think about your audience. So make sure that it's accessible. I mean, in ideas, for instance, you will notice that we use a lot of acronyms, but when we're writing proposals, we make sure that even the smallest details of acronyms are spelled out right, because you might assume that even though it's going to a panel of development people, they might not necessarily understand your acronym. It might be an acronym that is well fitted within your specific domain. So for instance, if you're looking at climate change, or if you're looking at circular economy, for instance, it might not necessarily be something that's familiar to the panel members. So make sure that you spell out these acronyms. But also, as I said, it has to be coherent, right? So don't let your ideas wander all over the place. You have to start explaining why your idea is important and what's the difference that's going to make, and how you then will bring in that change by getting this money and what that will allow you to do. So be clear, be conscious as you explain, concise as you're explaining, but also be clear in terms of the achievable outputs. Don't just promise things that you will not be able to achieve. Also look at, having like a clear dissemination strategy in place. How are you going to communicate the findings of that research to your audience, to the users of the research, but also to wider audiences, right? So we're not only just talking about academic audiences. It could be research that is looking at public sector, for instance. How are you going to communicate? Is the language that you will use accessible to them? So you have to think of the different channels that you will use and the different types of events that you will use to give out this information. But also you need to justify, why do you need the money that you're asking for, right? Why does the funder need to pay you £400 a day? You need to explain that. So it's also important to do that. Is that, okay.
Apologies. Can you see presenter view now? I did that by accident.
I can see presenter view.
Oh, how do I escape?
There we go. Now we're back. So make sure that you include all the costs, but also link them to the activities, right? No, go back to the other one, the Be Strategic one. Please. Next one, I think. Yeah, that one. So, we've touched on this so many times to say, be realistic in terms of what you can achieve. Don't promise that you will build a center, when actually what you're asking for is, for instance, activities. Don't promise that you'll bring water if wherever you're working, in your proposal, you did not ask for water, right? So it's always important to do some background check, in the specific area that you want to ask funding for. And the area that you want to go and work in, what are the needs of those people, right? I'm sure most of you have attended Robert Chambers's seminars at the beginning of the year. I don't know whether this academic year he did it or not, but he normally does the, you know, participatory rural appraisal approach, where you have to find out what people want before you decide what you're going to do with them. So don't just develop these ideas in a vacuum and assume that you will take it in a community and the community will accept it, right? Do your homework first before you can take it then to a fund and say, you know, I want to do this. But also think about whether you're the appropriate person to lead the application. We do see a lot of different calls under different funders, and some are quite specific. So for instance, like the Natural Environmental Research Council, for instance, you know, if they put up a call, if a social scientist leads that proposal, chances are very minimal for them being successful, even if they have very good partners, because obviously the panel will be looking for natural environmental sciences, right? So if you're not the expert, let others who can do that work for you, and you can also be a partner in that application. So think through, what qualities do your partners bring? What complementarity is there between you and all your partners, and make sure that everybody is placed in the right place. But also review the guidance for reviewers. As I said, most calls will indicate what they're looking for. So read them, memorize them if you have, and ask whether your proposals are actually addressing the issues that they will be looking for, right? And if you're looking for more experience, look for fellowships instead, rather than large grants. So you can start with smaller grants. So we know that there are different individual funding applications that are available. It could be related to your academic criteria. It could be related to you building a specific expertise that you want to put up as part of your development. So think about the different angles that you can actually apply for funding, rather than just thinking I need to go big in the first instance. A lot of the academics that we work with will start with very small application forms. So for instance, some of the consultancies that I mentioned earlier are very small opportunities. They will go for them, and then they'll grow with experience. They'll have gained enough, you know, understanding of what is expected. So they will take it forward like that. If you have any questions, I always stress that it's important to ask them, rather than assume that there's nobody who can answer your questions. A lot of these funders always have an open door policy where you can send questions before the deadline. So make sure that you read the course specifications first thing, and then if you don't understand, then go ahead and ask the questions. And also attend any events, right, that are available that you can actually learn from. There's somebody who Niranjan wants to add something about fellowship funding. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, so I used to work for an organization that worked with children with developmental disabilities. And so a large part of our team were actually doctors and therapists who had to be trained a lot. I mean, who went through rigorous training even after their master's degrees and all of that. So, so for one such so we had this one person who was extremely experienced, and she was considered an expert in her field. And there was actually a fellowship funding opportunity that the Society of, I think it was a society that dealt with behavioral pediatrics or something like that, that had this opportunity that said, we will fund, the expenses or the professional charges paid towards a particular expert in this field. And so we actually were able to pay that person's salary through this fellowship funding. So they were very specific about the qualifications of the person, the role of the person, and the expertise of that person. But once that we were able to match those two things, the requirement and the person's qualification at our end, we were actually able to secure funding to meet that person's salary for about 3 to 4 years. So even when you're having experts on your team, there are specific opportunities like these that really do help. Just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is just what would be consisting on the evaluators panel, right? you know, as I said, academics are a minority on the panel because there's always a larger group that they have to consider, that have to review applications. But also the assessors will actually have a process that they follow in terms of how they look at the applications. They'll put a scoring criteria. It's usually between 0 and 5, 0 being not fundable at all, like it doesn't even make sense, 5 being highly fundable. So it's always good to look at this. Sometimes you might not necessarily see this in the course specification itself, but most of the funders will have handbooks, for instance, like the UKRI will have handbooks for each of the different research councils, and they will outline in there what each criteria means. But also, obviously, do not leave room for error. As I said, small things can actually cost, you know, if you ignore looking at what is required in terms of font size, for instance, you know, somebody might just say, you know what, they are not bothered, so why should we be bothered? So they'll not consider your application as well. But also, as I said, you know, nowadays we're seeing a lot of requirements around interdisciplinary, around impact. So what change is a project going to have? And interdisciplinary, they don't just want to see social scientists, but they also want to see other disciplines involved. So, you know, you can have social scientists, you can have medical scientists, you can have arts and humanities involved in one proposal. They want to see more of that, but also they want to see you engaging with other sectors, not just the academic. Have you thought about, you know, engaging with civil society organizations or smaller organizations or non-government organizations? They want to see all this, but also working with the private sector as well. We're seeing a lot of that in evaluation criteria. But another thing as well is how will you disseminate the information, you know, that you will get out of this program or the proposal that you're putting up. It's important to demonstrate that you have thought through these things. So your abstract, in a nutshell, should cover most of those things, right? Most of the funders will ask you to write a summary. That summary should be clear, concise, but also cover the things that you are actually they're going to look out for, because that will give you an advantage for them to read it. Can I have the next slide, please? So as I said, that's an example of a scoring criteria. So yeah, 0, the proposal is nowhere near, right? 1, a little bit, but it's still, you know, it's still scored as poor, so you wouldn't get anywhere with the funding. Fair, obviously, a 2, good, a 3, 4, very good, and then 5, excellent. Now, the difficult thing with this scoring criteria is that they'll always look at 4 and 5, those that score 4 and 5. So you get an opportunity to respond to some questions. And depending on how you respond, chances are that they will fund you. If what you've said is not clear, or if all of them are still clear, but they only are restricted the funding available, they'll only fund the ones that were rated as 5. Next, please. So we'll give you, because we'll share these slides as well, right? We'll give you this, and you can click on some of the links as well to look at how people actually frame their responses to proposals, because I think it's always helpful when you read other people and then think about your idea. How would you then frame it using the kind of similar formatting or using similar justification in terms of thinking through the idea itself? So what's important, obviously, is what story you're telling, who's the audience, why does it matter, and why should it be funded now, and why are you the best person to do the work? Could I have the next slide, please? And then the next slide is for Rachel.
I don't know if it is. I'm not doing the case study, sorry.
Oh, it's not you. Okay,
No.
it's fine. It's fine. So this was just to help to give you an idea, actually, in terms of the types of funding opportunities sometimes that might come up. This is a funding opportunity that actually came up recently. As you can see, the deadline, I think, was yesterday. So, you know, they specify. So one other thing as well I need to share with you is make sure the deadline you know the exact time, because it depends with where the call is coming from. So there might be some time differences. Some people have missed submitting proposals before by thinking that the time reflected in the notification was exactly the same time as the country that they were in. So it's always important to pay attention to that. This one is very clear. It states what the duration is. So think about the feasibility of the work that you want to do, but also they have actually put the specific topic that they are focusing on, right? So if you look on your right, they're looking at development, social policy, and governance. You always have to ask yourself, are these the areas that I am working in or I'm thinking about? And then they have specified the countries that they want this work to focus on. So as you can see, you're limited in terms of the places that you can do the research. If none of the countries that are listed here are areas that you are interested in working in, then clearly that opportunity is not yours. So just leave it. Don't try to make things fit just because, oh, there's an opportunity. I know none of those countries, I don't have any experience, I might as well put it in. Because usually they will also look at what experience you have in working in those countries. So if you don't have country experience, you have to think about how you would demonstrate that. Could it be through your partners, for instance? If you have a partner who has experience in those countries, then fine, but then you have to gauge whether the funder will look at that as something tokenistic or as something that's meaningful that you can take forward, because it's also important for you to build your experiences in some of these areas. And also then they've outline the budget, right, in terms of what's allowed for the country studies as well as for multi-country studies. So it depends. If you do one country, you get that amount of money, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your budget has to reach that amount of money. Sometimes, you know, your program might be less than that. So don't always go for the upper end. Make sure that you're somewhere which sits comfortably, but is also feasible in terms of the work that you plan to do. The next slide, please. So yeah, so this is just to kind of share. They will always have like frequently asked questions that you can actually go on, because you have some questions that you might need to ask. In this specific one, I can verify actually that they were only you could only apply if you're in the global south. You could not lead if you're in the global north. And you could also only apply for one, so you couldn't be involved in more than one application. So there's a lot to think about when you're putting in applications. So always sign up for any events. Like for them, they held information events. It's always important to go and hear, because the chances are that there will always be something there that they will share that will not necessarily be in any of the documentation that is available. But also check the application process itself. Most of the applications that we do in IDS go through our office, and every funding application that we make that is 100,000 and above comes through our office. And part of that is for us to make sure that we are following the guidelines that are stipulated, but also to make sure that we help to remove the pressure from the person who's applying. Because you can imagine when you're making the application, there's so many things to think about. And we do this all the time. It's pretty straightforward for us, whereas it would be daunting for somebody who doesn't do this all the time. If you don't have that available in your organizations, you need to think about what are the things that I can do to help me to facilitate that process. So whether it's drawing up a timetable that allows you to do things in advance, check everything that you need to do in advance. That's always also helpful as well. But also, yeah, so yeah, she's Susie kindly puts some of the hidden eligibility criteria. Some of it sometimes is not obvious on the application guidelines itself. So you always have to go back and check, especially if you have more than one person interested. So is that number 18 now, Rachel? That's for Rachel now.
Okay, my turn. Thank you, everyone. So I think what we're going to do, in case anyone needs any caffeine or a toilet break, we're going to have 3 minutes just to go and stretch your legs. But then while you're doing that, please can you complete this Mentimeter, which is basically a poll that helps to create a word cloud at the end of it. And I would like you to write 3 words or short phrases that describe what partnering means to you. So any particular values or definitions or approaches, and we'll see what comes out of it. So you can either follow that URL, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code. So I've got 23 minutes past on my phone, and we'll be back at 26 minutes past, if that's okay for everyone. Any immediate questions? No, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second then. See you in 3 minutes.
It's a very good question. I was going to try and catch Rachel before she left, but she's gone. She'll be back in a minute. Wesley, have you got the code? Because I don't have the PowerPoint presentation. Perfect, thank you. And if anybody's got any questions or things they want to ask Wesley or I while we're, or Jack, if he's still around as well, while we're here, then please do so.
And also, just to add, Michelle actually kindly puts a link for the startup funding. So for the person who asked this question, you can apply for this up to 3 years as a graduate, so you can take a look at it.
So fun seeing it coming through on the word cloud. Ooh, what fun. Yay.
We should have done the same for what does funding or looking for funding look like?
Pain, crying.
And I would have it on my wall to remind me.
Okay, I'll give people a couple more minutes. Oh, there's one coming out good and strong on the word cloud. Okay, could people put a message in the chat box so I know whether people are back? And I'm going to try and share my screen on the Mentimeter. Ta-da! Can everyone see that? Matching of organizational cultures, that's an interesting one. What do you do when we don't have similar organizational cultures? A safe space for reviewing and reflection, I like that. Fun, I like that. Mutually beneficial, we've got that coming up a few times. Collaborative and collaboration. Agreement, also interesting what happens when there isn't agreement, but you have shared goals at the end of it. What happens if you agree on the process or where you want to end up, but not the other side? Okay, I'll leave it up in case anyone was making a cup of tea and hasn't had a chance to finish that, and we can try and send it around with the PowerPoint at the end. Oh, it's so much fun seeing it all pop up. Thank you everyone for participating in that. Okay, so I wanted to cover A few pointers about how IDS works with partners, and then a little bit about the kind of skills and attributes that are helpful in developing partnerships, and some of the considerations that we look at when we're developing partnerships through a proposal. In the first half of the presentation, I was very rudely looking at my phone to try and find some specific examples of donor guidelines for partnerships, but I think Wezi has actually covered most of them, so I can share them if helpful, but they might not be needed. So what I wanted to express with this first slide is just the real range of partnerships that IDS engages with. And this is why I love working with IDS, because we're known as a research organization, we're known as engaged researchers, but we still think that research partnerships are the main body of partnerships that we work in. But we work in learning and knowledge partnerships, networking, consultancies, policy advisory, communications. So I just thought I'd give you a couple of examples of these. And if anyone wants to know more about how they're structured or who funds them, I'd be happy to share more information. I've put them in the notes of this slide, so you might be able to access those. So for example, we have multiple learning partnerships. Our Knowledge for Development program is a key one, where we support learning journeys on themes of interest to DFID staff members. So they help to set their own learning goals on issues including climate change. Networking. Until recently, when the funding was unfortunately cut, we were part of the African Digital Rights Network, which brought together activists and researchers and policymakers from across Africa working on digital citizenship and inclusion and digital rights. There's major research consortia, including the Coalition for Religious Equality, and I can remember all of the acronyms, but never all of the breakdowns of the acronyms. Other research consortia, including ones on child labour, for example. There's projects that and partnerships that are more development project implementation focused. So for example, we work with Sight Savers on disability inclusion, where we work with disabled people's organisations across Africa on livelihood activities. We might do consultancy partnerships where an organisation contracts us to conduct programme evaluations. We do professional development collaborations. For example, Miguel Loureiro in the governance cluster works with bureaucrats in Pakistan, Brazil and Nigeria to develop their approaches to participatory public policy making. There's other policy influence and engagement partnerships. For example, our trilateral development cooperation engagement with the Brazil equivalent of DFID and now FCDO. There might be services, which could include things like brand development, comms development, and even down to catering. There's communications of research uptake collaboration. So for example, Health Systems Global is a huge network of organizations working on health systems, and we provide support for their communications, which includes helping with their massive conferences every year. I think they call them unconferences, and managing their knowledge base. There's also funders, and we often think about funders in terms of partnerships. So I've already given the example of DFID, but we've also got collaborations with SDC and CEDA in Europe that take on more of a kind of learning partnership. And we, though there are power imbalances in terms of, you know, we are expected to deliver on their funding commitments, we're a learning partnership. And then of course, under research, there's lots of different levels of collaboration that we've that this nice little diagram tries to explain. So we see partnerships as a scale that go from transactional to transformational. So on the transactional side, it might be about service delivery, about data collection, and generally there's a sort of expected output at the end of the project, and it's potentially less collaborative, and it's a sort of yeah, there's more risk on the primary investigator than on the subcontractors. And this goes up to a more transformational form of partnership where risk is shared. There's been collaboration in the co-creation of activities and approaches and methodologies. There's mutual accountability. The relationships might be more complex, and part of the impact will be the partnership itself, not necessarily just the outputs. So some of the skills and attributes for brokering partnerships, and I'll send a link to the source of these past 2 slides on the chat in a second. It's a really useful website in case anyone's interested. It's called partnershipbrokers.org or something like that. But there's things like understanding the specific contexts and challenges of working in partnership, and also respecting differences and taking time to get to know those differences, but also the similarities. There's having confidence and skill in having difficult conversations. So it was interesting to see in the word cloud that agreement came up so often, and what happens when you don't agree? Does that just mean that you're not partnering anymore, or does it mean that you find where your remaining synergies and shared values or shared objectives remain, and trying to work towards them and finding compromise? There's linked to that having empathy and respect for these differences and values. So we like to say that we work with organizations that share our values, but we then potentially end up just working in echo chambers. So you will see increasingly that we work with organizations that, you know, if IDS doesn't call ourselves a religious organization, then we're working with civil society that represent particular religions, and we might identify a range of values within them, many shared, many differentiated, but that doesn't mean that we can't have really exciting impact together and learn from each other. There's some more practical things like the ability to synthesize information, balancing being able to vision the partnership and what you could achieve, but also being able to follow up and being realistic about what can be achieved. Being able to keep up communication and maintain relationships with partners. There's also a little bit about linking the many different priorities of our colleagues, whether that's funding, research, or strategic initiatives, and trying to prioritize these and find space for each of your colleagues within the partnership. There's also a bit of a skill about learning to pitch ideas to busy people and to be able to express the added value of both your own organization and the partnership. So, what are some of our considerations when developing partnerships for a proposal? And obviously, you'll have seen from Wesley's presentation that there's so many different funders and there's so many different kinds of criteria and processes that you go through. And the reality of it is that sometimes you'll have 3 weeks to develop a proposal, and you just need to go with who you know. And you need to go with what's efficient and where the relationships exist. And work from there. And other times you might have more scope to do more fuller mappings of you know, what's needed in the partnership. So it's a range, and I think IDS is quite realistic about that, and we have a good balance between knowing having great networks of really strong partners, but also taking time to build new networks. So when you hear about a funding opportunity or have an idea for a project, take time to assess what is needed, what knowledge, skills, expertise, networks, financial capacity are needed to meet the project objectives first, but also obviously the funder requirements. Funders often ask why this particular partnership is the best formation to achieve the objectives. So it's good to start off by thinking about that. It's good to be realistic and quite humble about what your own role is and your added value, and be able to step back and take feedback when people say that your role may be better placed elsewhere, or they take a different opinion to how they could add value. And there's also a little bit about what resources are required. So if you have £100,000, you can't probably engage 10 significant partners and ensure that all of their time is adequately covered. The second stage is more about identifying the specific needs that are required. So a more detailed mapping of the disciplinary and methodological approaches that are appropriate for the project, thematic knowledge, experience, networks, the type of organizations that you're looking for. So whether you need them all to be academic institutions with representatives that have PhDs and a significant body of work, or whether you're meant to have a private sector organization involved, what their experience of partnership working is, and something that I think potentially gets missed off a little bit is their financial and administrative capacity, because if they're about to receive a large chunk of money that their systems haven't necessarily had to manage before, that can be quite overwhelming. The third phase of narrowing it down is who do we already know and who do we have a relationship with. This could help with efficiency and value for money during the project. If there isn't anyone that we know that directly meets the criteria, do we know anyone through our networks? Can we recommend anyone? And who else in IDS has worked with them? And the final stage is selecting partners through an honest appraisal of whether they are the best fit, and whether we complement each other's skills as well. I think sometimes we get very excited when we meet with a partner and we realize that we have all of the same areas of expertise and we work in a lot of the same geographies. And sometimes I think you have to take a step back and think, are we adding anything to each other's body of work, or do we have quite shared goals and we potentially need to find someone that brings an entirely different skill or approach? Managing expectations is very important at this stage as well, and being open to changing your direction. So a couple of things that I wanted to flag to you as well, because I think that was my last slide, is that, and I'm looking at my phone because I opened it on there rather than on my screen, excuse me. The Rethinking Research Collaborative did a really exciting piece of work a couple of years ago with UKRI and GCRF, where they outlined 8 principles for equitable partnerships. And I'll share these in the chat afterwards, but they include putting poverty first, critically engaging with the context, redressing evidence hierarchies, being able to adapt and respond and respect diversity of knowledge and skills, committing to transparency, investing in relationships, and keeping on learning. And I found this a really valuable resource in sort of checking your approach throughout the proposal writing process or any kind of partnership development process, to make sure that you're maintaining the values and principles that create effective partnerships. So yeah, I think that was everything I wanted to cover. I guess maybe just to save some back and forth, my key takeaway was to make sure you think carefully about what you contribute to a partnership and what you want to get out of it, and being open to be flexible and adaptive with this, and learning to communicate your, I hate using the word value, your contribution clearly and concisely, and learning from others about how they express this. And being patient, because relationships can take a long time to develop and are based on trust, mutual respect, inclusivity, etc. So maybe Wesi, if you wanted to step in and summarize any more of these points, or we could jump straight to questions.
No, you've summarized it perfectly. But I wonder whether, yeah, just open it up for questions actually, because obviously our audience may have had different partnering opportunities that they probably thought things differently, and how we can improve our practice as well. There's no questions in the chat.
Just going to send those links that I mentioned. Okay.
Thank you, Rachel. We've, you know, as Michelle said, we've given you loads and loads of information to take on, but also to digest. And, you know, the reality of this as well is that some of the things might not make sense now because you're not putting in an application, you don't need to think about partnerships. But once the time comes, we're hoping that some of the information and some of the knowledge that we have shared today will be of use to you as well. And for me, I think, you know, the kind of main takeaways from this as well is obviously if you're thinking about applying or looking for funding, you know, think about what, you know, find opportunities that actually fit with your specific area. Don't just jump on any opportunity, because I can assure you opportunities are always available. Even now that we're saying that some funding opportunities have kind of slowed down a lot, there are still opportunities, but are they relevant? You know, you must always ask yourself that question. And also, once you identify that opportunity, read the guidelines, read it as many times as you can. It will surprise you at how many things we catch out, like maybe a week before submission, that we probably missed out, but it was quite key for the application itself. So it's always important. And if you're working as part of a team as well, once you've read it, you know, discuss it with your team members, with your colleagues, because your colleagues might understand some things differently. You might interpret some information completely differently. So that's also quite important. But also familiarize yourself, you know, with the funder that you're interested in. It could be one funder, it could be several funders. Make sure you research what are the types of work that they've funded in the past, what are the areas that they're heading to in terms of going forwards, and how does that align with the type of work that you want to carry forward as you continue working in a specific area. But also seek guidance from those that have actually applied for funding to that specific funder. You know, as I said, in IDS, we're very fortunate that we have over 60 academics who are putting in applications at any given time. I can assure you, I can't remember how many applications we put in, but when I joined IDS, we were putting in at least maybe only between 8 and 10 applications per year. But our funding applications have gone high. Like last year, remind me, Michelle, how many applications we put in last year? It's more than it's more than 140 applications. So that's
I was going to say, I think it's about 150, something like that in a normal year.
Yeah. So that is how busy we get. So you can, that's why we have this experience, because we've seen so many different applications and we've learned as well from each of these applications. We always pick something up that we didn't know in the previous application. So it's always important as well to speak to people who have received funding or who have applied to that specific funder. And then finally, think carefully about what you will contribute to partnership and what you want to get out of it. Rachel summarized it quite clearly, you know, in terms of ask yourself these questions. And sometimes those questions can be uncomfortable, but they will help you shape who you want to work with, because you have to think, you know, the case study that we showed you was for 36 months. If you end up with the wrong partner, that 36 months can be hell. So make sure that it is meaningful for you as well. Thank you very much. Any questions, any reactions before we go?
There are a couple in the chat, Wezzy.
Okay.
The first one is from Alana, which is about access to proposal writing examples and structure. And I think there was a link in the presentation, which we will share afterwards. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Right.
So that's that answered. And then there's another question around honing your skill as a writer, as a proposal writer. Is there any practical solutions that you can give to that? The suggestion is that maybe practicing free writing or something similar would be useful.
Yeah. So free writing, creative writing, that's all useful. And also another thing as well is work alongside people who have written a lot, right? So when I started working in fundraising, I didn't have as much experience as I have now. My writing was horrible, right? My ideas were all over the place. Even if I would work with people, it wasn't coming out through properly. But by working alongside them, I have learned how to write properly, coherently, but also strongly. And sometimes if you feel that the idea of leading a proposal is daunting, work with somebody that you know is a very good writer. Working alongside them will help you get better at your writing while you're also developing your own skill and also making sure that you're putting in through an application that is actually quite easy to read as well. I think one of the things that I've seen as well with the applications that come through our office, the applications that are written in a very complicated way are the ones that often don't get funded. It's about the language, right? Make sure what you're writing is clear, simple, and easy to understand. Yeah, it just makes a difference actually in terms of how you write. So yeah, you develop it over time. I think that's all right. Yeah, that's all.
This isn't my experience from IDS because I've only been involved in writing a couple of proposals, but I have a bit of a sort of a routine that's a bit boring with writing proposals. And I used to make a table with the key requirements and put the key text against each requirement and then sort of transpose it into the proposal text. Because I think sometimes it's hard to match up the proposal sections with the requirements and you think, oh, great, I've addressed the sections, and you potentially forget to address some of the specific requirements and you forget some experience that is relevant that you could include. So that's my boring and structured way of approaching it.
I don't think it's boring in any way, because if you look at our pre-proposal meetings, that's basically what we do. You know, we put exactly the words, because we also know that funders will be looking for specific language. So you have to understand what their language is, and that helps you, because they'll be looking for a specific word. And if you haven't actually adapted it onto your proposal, they'll kind of think, do they actually understand what we're looking for? So it's a very practical way of doing it. Yeah. I've also added another link in there for ESRC in terms of how to write a good research proposal. There's clips as well in there that also helps, that will help with understanding what evaluators will be looking for or what they expect to see in applications. And this one, trust me, this one, I've used it so many times in IDS proposals and it works. Over to you, Michelle.
I'm surprised every time my name is mentioned. Okay, so I think we're just about at the end. If anybody has any questions after the workshop, because my brain works, so about a day later I'll suddenly go, oh, I wish I'd have asked that, because I managed to process it all. Then just email me, alumni@ids.ac.uk, and we'll forward it on to Wesi or Rachel or whoever. And Rachel's kindly put her email address in there as well if you want to contact her directly. So yeah, so when I put the poll up at the beginning about doing a mini reunion, there weren't very many people interested. So I haven't set anything up. But if you want to do it, then you need to say now. Otherwise, we will sign off, and we will come back and we will do a mini reunion at another time. It's absolutely fine. Do you want me to put the poll up again? Are people looking at me confused? Okay. Relaunch. Okay, yeah, so I think the majority of people won't be able to come. It's a really long workshop, so I'm not surprised. And it was a last minute thing that I'd come up with. So we'll do it another time, and I'll make sure that everybody knows, and we've got proper time and everything in there. So we won't do it today, but we will do it on another day to make sure that you can all get together and have a chat. and say hello. We do have another 5 minutes in the Zoom. If you want to stay and have a chat with somebody that you've noticed in the Zoom call, absolutely fine. If not, I hope to see you next week at Terry's lecture, or if not, at something else that we're doing for the class of 2020 in the future. So yeah, just thank you to Wezi and Rachel for doing this for us.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have to leave because I'm going in another meeting. So, but feel free to send any questions to Michelle. Bye.
We will put the recording up on the Alumni Network website. I just need to grab the recording and host it, basically. So it might be a few days, but I will put it up for you.
Thank you.